Welcome to the Open Talent Report, the award-winning podcast where we dive deep into the emerging trends in global employment, the future of work, the talent crisis, the demographic deficit, and the new world of work with our expert host, Conor Heaney. Conor is the managing director at CXC EMEA, a company that takes the hassle out of finding, compliantly engaging and paying contractors anywhere in the world. In this podcast, Conor brings you captivating conversations with top CEOs, visionary founders, and industry experts. Together, they shed light on all things open talent and the evolving nature of work itself. So grab your headphones and join us on this exhilarating journey.
Hello and welcome to this week's show, where I'm delighted to be joined by Shaziya Kurmani, Associate Director at leading UK headquartered law firm Osborne Clarke. For those of you in the human capital, staffing and workforce solutions world, Osborne Clarke is the go-to for employment law, labour law, M&A and many other services. Shaz, I'm sure you'll agree. In the UK, for our listeners and those watching on YouTube, we've seen a plethora of sweeping employment and labour law reform over the last 6 years, from IR35 in the private sector to the much debated, much discussed Employment Rights Bill. The law relating to UK umbrella companies in the sector generally, many would say is long overdue, and we definitely subscribe to that view in CXC. And this episode is a must-watch if you have umbrella workers, intermediaries, umbrella firms in your supply chain that your organisation is working with in the UK, whether you're an end client, MSP or platform. So with that rather long introduction to what we're going to talk about, and this is our first show in ages, so thanks so much to our listeners for their patience. But the show is off to a bang with one of our favourite topics, which is labour and employment law reform. And the UK is one of the largest labour markets in the world. It's one of the most innovative. And I'm really delighted to welcome Shaz to our show because Shaz is one of the foremost experts in this sector. We've had the pleasure in my day job at CXC of working with Shaz and her team for many years. And I'm really excited, Shaz, to have you on, and a very warm welcome to you, Shaz. How the hell are you doing this morning? How are you keeping?
I am keeping as well as you can be for what is the second week back to work from the Christmas holidays. So, yep, doing well. Hope you are too.
I'm in the same boat, Chaz. I can just about muster a conversation, which is good for, I hope, our listeners. And
I'm very glad we didn't record this last week because I've been forgetting a lot of words. So thank you.
Yeah, same as that, Shaz. Well, Shaz, listen, thanks so much for making the time. I know you're a very busy lady and employment lawyer, so really, really appreciate you coming on the show, and thanks for making the time for our audience. So, Shaz, a question we begin with on all of our shows. Well, what's your story? How did you enter into the world of law and employment and labour law specifically? What was your journey?
I mean, my journey is quite bland, but I suppose I didn't actually want to be a lawyer when I was younger, and I wanted to be a doctor, and I did all the work experience and I was really excited about it. And then as I did more and more work experience, I got less and less excited by it, and I didn't really know what else to do. So I went to my mum and I was like, I don't want to do medicine anymore. And most mothers would be very disappointed by this news, and she was, because in her mind I'd built up the dream I was going to be a doctor. And then we had to sit down and discuss it, and then I ended up deciding on law, and I have not looked back. Since then, as Conor's identified, I am a contingent workforce lawyer. So it means I live in the messy middle between employment law, tax law, and how businesses actually get things done. I work with staffing companies, umbrellas, platforms, and end clients on how they engage with temporary workers, contractors, gig workers, and outsourced teams, and how to do that in a way that's legally robust, tax compliant, and still commercially realistic. A lot of my work sits where status and tax collide, which makes me really well placed to discuss the umbrella tax reforms, but also IR35, PAYE versus self-employed treatment, agency tax risk, and the question of who really bears the liability when a supply chain comes under scrutiny from HMRC. I didn't really set out to specialise in contingent workforce law when I started, but I was drawn to it when I was doing my employment seat because it's where some of the most interesting and sensitive questions arise, like who is really responsible for the worker, who should be paying the taxes, how much risk are businesses pushing down the chain, and is that really sustainable? Outside of work, I'm a mum to 2 young children, and if I do get a spare moment, I like to bake, although yeah, I mean, it's something my almost 6-year-old is currently co-opting. So she's gotten really into it too, which sort of takes the really calming, relaxing element away from it. And it's no longer that peaceful moment for myself. And it's just another chaos management type activity. I also currently watch The Traitors, which is a total chef's kiss of a season this year. Although I do say that about all of them. So
Oh, I love that intro, Shaz, and that I've been watching The Traders avidly in Ireland, where I live. Although my wife would argue that I don't actually live there because I spend so little time there. But they had an Irish version. It's not quite as good, but it has been very enjoyable. But UK Traders is it is shit. I like that description. Shaz, I know we're here to discuss umbrella reform, but something you said piqued my interest as a total workforce labour law geek, right? Which is probably the
no.
best way to describe myself. Um, one of the things, and I've always welcomed and do welcome the IR35 in the private sector. I think it was long overdue to try and bring some certainty where maybe there wasn't, because a lot of it was case law based previously, and of course it was in the public sector, private prior to that. But one of the things that frustrates me about it is, do you remember when? Well, you don't. We don't remember this. We're far too young. But when Britain owned America, right? They had the colonies out there.
Oh,
The main gripe was around taxation without representation, right? And with IR35, that's really what it strikes me as, right? So if you're deemed inside or outside IR35 for tax purposes, right? So if you're inside, you pay the
mm.
appropriate taxes as almost akin to a PAYE worker. But in
Yes.
short, you don't have the employment rights that you would as an employee for tax purposes, and it's so unusual to me that you basically have that scenario. Do you ever think about it that way, Shaz, or is that just a rather
Oh,
esoteric way of looking?
we have thought about it that way pretty much the entire time we've been in this, area. And for years we've been promised by various governments under various guises a sort of consultation on employment status and how to reconcile the employment tax status with the employment law status. I think the UK is probably one of the only places that still has like a 3 worker status model. Most other countries actually just have the 2 worker status model, so it's self-employed or employed. Um, I think, or there has been, murmurings on the grapevine. We are closer than ever before to getting that consultation going. So the murmurings where we're supposed to hear it by the end of last year, that obviously didn't happen. But there was also the chaos with the Employment Rights Act because it became law. But what has been known as the Employment Rights Bill for so long, but the chaos being the government was really focused in on trying to get that over the line, with the Lords very much trying to stop it getting over the line, which probably delayed a lot of the other activity they had going on. So we're hoping to see something in that space again at the start of this year, but it's also something I struggle to hold my breath on. There's been, to determine employment status in the UK, it's based on 130 years of case law. It's a lot. And to get that in a consultation and get some sort of, something that seems sensible, that can be workable going forward, is going to take a lot of work. And it's whether or not the government has the appetite for that level of work to make it work. But I totally agree with you. It is completely unfair that once you get taxed as an employee, you don't end up getting those employment rights. So I see the real benefit of actually fixing it. It's just whether or not anyone has the appetite or ability to fix it that I'm struggling with.
Yeah, same. I hope they can close that gap, Shaz. And Shaz, sorry for hijacking. I know we're here to talk about the umbrella, but one of the things, just if we can stay on this topic just for a moment or so, and then we'll get on to the meat of the bones. Have you noticed an increase in enforcement actions or audits from HMRC in the private sector? in the 2024-2025 period? And is there any, not advice, because we're not here to take legal advice and nor are you here to give it, but based on your experience and your understanding of what's going on, Shaz, are you seeing an increase in that based on your clients?
Yeah, so what we've been seeing is an increase in activity. So it's not yet reached the point where HMRC has launched a formal investigation or anything like that, but there's been an increase of activity going on in the background. And we think the reason that we haven't seen anything formal yet is they're still not quite yet at the end of their limitation period. So they have 4 years for PAYE where they can look back and recover that tax. And that period for them is coming up to an end in April. So we're expecting to see quite a big explosion of activity. It's something we've been talking to other sort of providers in the area, so people who provide insurance products, and they could also concur that that's probably what they're expecting to see as well. I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone. It's just, based on what we've been seeing, that's what we've been hearing. So yes is the answer, but not anything formal or concrete.
Okay, thanks, Shaz, and we'll get on to the topic at hand. But I think it's important for our listeners and those watching just to understand what may be coming down the tracks in relation to enforcement or enhanced audit investigations from HMRC. So that was really interesting, Shaz. Thanks for going on that little journey with me there. So Shaz, if we can come back to the umbrella reform, in your view, why is the UK government pushing for this now?
I mean, I could answer it in 3 words, and it's tackling tax avoidance. And I will get into a bit more detail, but we have seen HMRC try to tackle the various abuses of umbrella companies through the years. I mean, most recently, we've seen it with a scheme involving fraudulent pay slips throughout the supply chain, which was trying to convince everyone in the supply chain that the individuals were engaged as an employee, but actually they're engaged via limited companies. We've also seen mini umbrella models where the employment is fragmented across multiple low rate entities to obtain a national insurance contribution relief and or benefit from flat rate VAT. We've seen disguised remuneration, elected deduction models where umbrella workers are treated as employed for the purposes of PAYE deductions, but self-employed for the purposes of expenses. And every time HMRC gets on top of one of these schemes or models that claims to save tax in the supply chain, but really is avoidance or evasion, another one just pops up. And to be honest, it was looking to be a struggle for them to keep up. And it's an expensive struggle, as they would have to litigate using legislation that might not quite cover the point they're making or quite cover the, entity they're going after. And it had enough laxity within that legislation that the umbrella companies being litigated against could argue against HMRC's case, which would keep driving up the cost for HMRC. Again, then taking away from what they're going to recover at the end.
Yes.
And I suppose the idea of the new umbrella reform legislation is to make it as inexpensive and simple as possible for HMRC to recover these unpaid taxes. It also provides HMRC with mechanisms to go after upstream parties, as another issue they have historically been facing is that umbrella companies don't tend to hold much value within them.
Yes.
So when they pursue them, there's very little to recover against. So I'm not really sure we could call it a tale as old as time, but it's certainly a tale as old as the past decade. HMRC is creating powers that allows it to recover PAYE and NICs from upstream parties who may have enabled the arrangements or at the very least should have noticed and prevented the umbrella company from being engaged.
The way you describe that, Charles, it strikes me that the government were almost playing whack-a-mole, right, within the existing or the previous.
Really?
Yeah, that's what it seems
It's
like.
totally like a whack-a-mole game, yes. Because every time umbrella companies would come up with something new, and it's obviously they have the difficulty, or the whole supply chain has the difficulty of there not being quite enough money within the supply chain to make it all workable. And then umbrella companies would come up with solutions or clever cases or whoever it is. And those solutions would be tax avoidance and tax evasion. And it would create a whole sort of system where actually the more, players who didn't want to engage in those sort of models were sort of held back because there was sort of this race to the bottom because the other players were there.
It's absolutely it's a fascinating sector, and that in many respects is unique to the UK. Shaz, like I can't think of other jurisdictions where we operate in as a business in my day job, or indeed any of the companies that we work with that has the similar structures in place, right? Maybe
Yeah.
some of the Nordic companies there is some similarities, but I think the UK is almost unique in terms of that specific sector. So, Shaz, getting into the more substantive detail then. Hey, just really for the benefit of our audience and our listeners, they're probably just beginning to get their heads around this, right? There's probably a clock ticking somewhere in the back of their minds going, this umbrella form, I know I need to do something about it. I know I need to be aware of it. But what do I need to know, essentially? So in your view and based on your experience and your understanding, Shaz, what do the proposed 2026 umbrella reforms actually include? And in your view, what's still unclear from what you've seen to date?
Right. So I think the big worry when these reforms were first introduced, from the umbrella company side at least, was that they wouldn't be able to hold employers' reference numbers, and that would have completely obliterated the umbrella company market in the UK. However, it has been confirmed umbrella companies will still be able to hold the umbrella employer's reference number, which means they'll still be able to pay the workers through their own PAYE payrolls. So, I mean, at first, I think it's very important to just clarify that's going to remain as is. So, what is changing is who is going to be liable for those unpaid taxes. The umbrella legislation, or the new umbrella legislation, introduces joint and several liability between the umbrella company and either the top agency that holds the contract with the client, or if there's no agency in the supply chain, or the agency is offshore, or the agency and umbrella company are connected, the end client.
Oh.
And that's for any tax that is not paid to HMRC by the umbrella company for whatever reason. So joint and several liability will be triggered where an umbrella company operates a compliant payroll, for example, but fails to pay the tax in full. And this will be the case. So it's regardless of the reason for the tax default. So it's important to note that none of these reasons would be uncovered by payslip or payroll compliance checks. So it's obviously important to keep doing them, but it's not just going to tackle situations where there's tax non-compliance. It will actually tackle situations where it's just not been paid for other reasons, which have actually popped up in recent cases we've seen.
Well,
So HMR...
Wow. Sorry, go ahead, Shaz. Sorry, I'll
No.
get back. No, please go ahead. I interrupted.
That's fine. HMRC can choose whichever party of the parties that are jointly and severally liable that it wishes to pursue for the unpaid taxes. It doesn't have to go after the umbrella company first, and that might seem unjust, but the intent HMRC has with the legislation is to ensure, through whichever means it can, that unpaid taxes are recovered. As we were just discussing, it's struggled for years with the sort of whack-a-mole situation. So it's now trying to recuperate unpaid tax. So when it was trying to recuperate them from the umbrella companies. So joint and several liabilities, its newest weapon to recover tax and try and shut down that tax non-compliance. So rather than have to expend energy trying to recover taxes from an entity that may have like little to no money to recover from, it's keeping its options open to recover from the bigger pockets.
Wow. So,
I mean, I've got more bombshells for you.
this is good. I love working with you, and this is why I'm so pleased you're on the show, right? So, what one thought occurred there? So, let's say you're big bank A, headquartered in the UK. You've got umbrella workers engaged through an umbrella company, right? And
Yeah.
like, if I was sitting in the HMRC's shoes, I'd be like, let's forget about this umbrella company. I'm going straight to big bank A because they've got all the money, right? So that's
Agree. But Big Bank A would likely have some sort of managed supply chain management involved. So it'd probably either have agencies or an MSP. So it's Big Bank A, it would likely be, unless, of course, all the agencies are connected to the umbrella company or all the agencies are offshore, which hopefully is unlikely and hopefully they will check, which is something and clients will need to be doing. But it would be the big agency or MSP that HMRC would be coming after in that situation.
Wow, interesting. And let's say for whatever reason, the intermediate, such as an MSP, for example, or like the top tier agency, like a master vendor. Sorry to use these terms for some of
Yeah.
our audience that aren't familiar with them, but most of our audience are familiar with this sector and practice in this sector, either on the buy side or the sell side or on the advisory side. Shaz, like yourself. But like, if for whatever reason the MSP couldn't pay, can HMRC go right to the end client or the end user?
I've not seen anything in the provisions where it can go after the end client where the agency is unable to pay but should have been the entity joint and severally liable. So I don't think that's in the legislation at all. But
Okay.
yeah,
Interesting. Very interesting. And then, Shaz, the other thing that just came to mind, and sorry for going back to IR35, but as I understand it, within the IR35 private sector legislation, there's almost three categories of, I'm going to use the word offense, even though it's not criminal, but like, so if it's willful, if it's reckless, and I can't remember the other, but I think there's three. But the way you've described the joint and several liability is that it's almost like strict liability. So
it is strict liability, correct?
strict liability. And so for the benefit of our audience, that what that really means in plain terms is there's no excuse, right? So if
I think it's the first time we've seen any legislation in this space where there's absolutely no defence. So even with the agency worker tax reforms in 2014, if you're provided with fraudulent documents, you could argue you've got a defence. And as you've identified with IR35, there's sort of defence mechanisms in place where if you're really deceived, you're not going to be held liable. But here, I think maybe HMRC, as we've also previously identified, got so caught up in their whack-a-mole
yeah,
where they would go after a party and the party would be like Teflon, like, here's my excuse, I was deceived. And that happens a lot with the umbrella company stuff. So again, like the ones who are using fraudulent documents, then the agency who might be liable could say, I was deceived by a fraudulent document, and HMRC was struggling to pin any of it down on anyone. So this legislation means they don't have to get engaged in that sort of slippery, trying to catch an eel type situation.
wow. Like, of course, I'm thinking selfishly about companies like CXE, selfishly about companies like yours, but
Yes.
in some respects, Shaz, this is a bonanza for companies like ours because the advisory and the governance and risk that we can help shape and advise companies on is going to be really important when it comes to strict liability because there is no
Yeah.
defense. You got to get in order. That's as simple as I can make it.
I 100% agree. And the thing about doing due diligence on umbrella companies is the more offences umbrella companies started to create, the harder the due diligence becomes because there's more and more things to check against, and it
Yes.
becomes quite a hard task to actually get your head on top of. So yes, engaging with suppliers who are on top of this and who understand this is something that end clients will probably be looking to do because it would really help them manage what is a really big risk, but also a really difficult management piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we can stay on this topic, Shaz, if that's okay, like in your view, Shaz, how do you think these reforms will impact the contractors stroke workers, if that's the appropriate descriptor, the recruitment agencies that are supplying workers and engaging umbrella companies and end clients? I think we've covered, right, in terms of the actual end user of the work or the labor. But do you have a view on that, Shaz?
Yeah, so just to cover end clients a little bit more, they might be feeling that where there's an agency or an MSP involved, it's business as usual because it won't end up being their problem. However, we have identified just earlier on some of the few situations where even where an agency is involved in the supply chain, the end user may end up being the party with joint and several liability. So where the agency is offshore or connected to the umbrella company, even where there's an agency in the supply chain, the end user may end up jointly and severally liable. On this basis, we think end users will want to look more closely at their contingent worker supply chains just to ensure there's no gremlins they're not aware of. So I think that's a really big piece to start with now. They just really need to get on top of who's in their supply chain, how big it is, what their risks are, just really get on top of that management piece. And like you've identified, if you've got suppliers in your supply chain who can help you do that, that is going to be just, you can't put money on that. the risk may end up being too much for some end users, and it may well end up being the case that they end up prohibiting the use of umbrella companies, or themselves provide a small list of umbrella companies they will allow, which will likely be the larger, very easily demonstrably compliant providers. There may also be a renegotiating of contracts to ensure the protections that they have are as tight as they can be. We'll see. I think a lot of it depends on how the end client feels about the risk and the decision they come to. So there's various options we see playing out in the market, and it really just does depend on the end client themselves. So for agencies engaging with the umbrella companies, we think they'll definitely need to increase their diligence on umbrella companies. And it may be that they start using third-party auditors and accreditations to help them meet that compliance burden, bearing in mind that no accreditation is, completely risk-proof. You still can be jointly and severally liable if that accreditation fails. So it's just, it's an additional tool. It helps, build your defense and make you feel safer, but it's not going to help if they come knocking and it's all gone wrong in spite of that. I also think it's likely agencies will narrow their umbrella panels, so they might rely on the bigger players too. So I think a lot of the smaller umbrella companies are likely to fall away because of this, because it's easier for those big players to emphasize the other benefits they have as well, such as fast onboarding, fair holiday pay handling, responsive issue resolutions. They can set up processes that are more transparent in terms of how they pay workers in a way that agencies and end clients can have confidence in. And we understand a lot of the bigger players have already been working hard on that in anticipation of the new regime, and some may come up with more innovative ways to support supply chains. So we'd be surprised if the bigger players suffer a significant loss of business, providing they get those systems right. But we do think it's going to lead to a natural decline of non-compliant umbrella companies. The margins with umbrella companies might be revisited by agencies to ensure that the compliance burdens can be funded somehow. There'll probably be less scope for the hidden skims that we have in this industry. And it may be that workers see lower take-home pay than before, just because whenever there's any of this that needs to be funded, it does tend to push its way down the supply chain as well. It may lead to disgruntlement, but there should also be increased communications with contractors by agencies on upfront expectations for take-home pay, expenses rules, and holiday pay. And that should help prevent the engagement that contractors want to do via non-compliant umbrella companies. Because the other thing to always remember in the background with PAYE and NICs is actually it is a liability of the contractor. It's enforced against those up in the supply chain, but it is their liability as well. So push comes to shove, HMRC could go after them. Not something we see happen a lot, but we did see it happen with the loan schemes. Whilst HMRC, so I've just said that, sorry. Staffing supply chains that rely on certain types of umbrellas to provide cash flow funding, so under which the umbrella company pays the worker before being paid by the agency or end client, may need to find other sources of funding. So invoice discounting arrangements will likely be part of the solution for many. However, with the joint and several liability in the background, it may well be that asset-based lenders will be unwilling to lend to agencies and MSPs if they are likely to become jointly and severally liable for the umbrella company tax compliance. We might see some movement of workers from umbrella companies that have been prohibited to other umbrella companies or in-house. This may be through the direction of an agency or MSP who wants to reduce their risk by directing the use of a specific umbrella, or we might just see umbrella companies moving to another of their choice when they're told they can't use a certain umbrella. I think this needs to be carefully managed to ensure there aren't any unintended consequences. Undoing risky legacy arrangements may not be straightforward because case law suggests that if umbrella workers are treated as chattels to be moved around at the whim of agencies or end clients, then they were never really employees of the umbrella company, and they were really employed by the agency or end client. So it's sort of like a sham risk. If so, this would raise complex questions around who's actually liable as the employer, and you just don't want to be getting involved in that. No, exactly. We also anticipate an increase in PSC arrangements. I mean, there's evidence looking at the ONS report from last year that there's already been a substantial increase of self-employed contractors. There's various reasons for that, I think, which probably aren't this legislation, bearing in mind it's not coming into force till April. But I think this is likely to add to that shift. So it's like the opposite effect of what we saw after the 2017 and 2021 reforms to IR35. It's only one we think worth considering where the arrangement is genuinely one that is self-employment. So, like we've just been discussing, IR35 is still there and is still being enforced.
Yeah.
Even though it's not visibly being enforced, it is being enforced.
Yes.
And we suspect whether or not there will be a broad movement to PSC contracting may depend on the high-profile IR35 assessments we see in the next 12 months or so, which we are expecting to see. We have seen another public sector enforcement quite recently, but still no public private sector news. So I think for some people, where there continues to be a seeming lack of enforcement, and I say seeming because we know there is enforcement activity, it may lead some to believe that the use of PSEs is a lower risk option. And then combining that with the recent employers' NICs rise and the element of statutory defence where fraudulent documents have been provided up the supply chain, PSC engagements may well start to look like the more attractive option, even if in reality they shouldn't be considered at all.
Shaz, that's absolutely fascinating, that analysis, right? On a number of bases. Interesting the circularity, right, where the labour market was almost strangled in 20, I wouldn't say 2017, but certainly when the private sector IR35 reforms came in. And interestingly, by way of comparison, when the Netherlands mooted a similar regime around classification, similar to IR35 for independent contractors, contracting fell off a cliff, right? There was 40% less registrations as PSCs or the equivalent in Netherlands in late 2024 and early 2025 for the last two quarters of, last quarter of 2024, first quarter of 2025. It stabilized somewhat, but there's huge concerns around labour market flexibility as a result of that. But that is hugely interesting. The interpretation and your thoughts on it, almost like a flight to PSC, and it makes sense actually when you think about it in the round. But I think one of the reasons why I love this sector so much, labour law, employment law, contingent, is because it's fascinating and because of its manifold impact on organizations potentially around financial, legal and reputational risk. And everything that you've outlined there touches on all those things within the sector and within providers and within organizations. And I think that's why I love it, Shaz, and that's why I love listening and working with you, because I think you've broken that down in such clear, practical and straightforward terms. And I think terms that will really resonate with our audience. So thanks so much for sharing that analysis. So that leads me on to a question though, Shaz. Like, if I was in an MSP today or in a recruitment agency that was engaging umbrella companies, I'd be thinking to myself, well, what the hell is a compliant umbrella based on this, based on the forthcoming legislation? Like, for example, and I don't know the answer to this, Shaz, but is there a licensing regime? What steps can you take as an organization at a high level to make sure that you are working with what could be deemed or perceived or is a compliant umbrella company? So what's your take on that, Shaz? Again, this is not legal advice, but merely your thoughts based on your experience and interpretation of the draft legislation.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you mentioned a licensing regime, and I think actually that was one of the ideas that was sort of mooted in the many years of consultation. So actually, the years of consultation actually cover pre my second child, through my maternity leave, and post. So yeah, this has really seen me through a nice period of my life. But they didn't settle on a licensing regime, which would have been quite a nice and neat way for people who are using umbrella companies to feel reassured, but it's just not the direction that we're going in. So a compliant umbrella company under the new rules looks like a compliant umbrella company should do now. So as much as I've been emphasizing a point that no amount of due diligence will save you from joint and several liability, due diligence on umbrella company suppliers will continue to be crucially important. It does still weed out the bad actors, and what you're trying to weed out is that sort of tax non-compliance piece. And there's loads. Like I said, it's a really difficult piece because there's so much non-compliance out there. But that due diligence is really what's going to get you in a good position to feel safe. So while it's no defense if something goes wrong, your due diligence makes it much less likely that something is going to go wrong. Additionally, there are reasons other than employment tax liability that make it important to check out your suppliers. There's still the Criminal Finance Act to comply with and the defence to that offence. So the offence for failing to prevent the associated persons of yours from criminally facilitating tax evasion. Yeah, it's a long-winded one, I'm sorry. But the defence is undertaking reasonable checks on suppliers. There are also other due diligence issues to be looking out for, such as national minimum wage issues and modern slavery. So it's still critically important that you yourself have done enough due diligence to reassure yourself that your supplier is compliant. And I think we've mentioned or touched on this before. We've been seeing a takeoff of newish accreditation platforms who offer to carry out in real time checks into whether or not an umbrella company made the correct deductions and whether the corresponding payments of all sums due to HMRC have been made, which is, again, being reassured of that is one of the best ways to be reassured that the tax has been paid to HMRC. So I imagine a lot of compliant umbrella companies will have this accreditation, and as I've been saying, all checks provide a useful tool to help lower the risk of engaging with an umbrella company, but no amount of checks fully removes the risk. So the joint and several liability risk remains, irrespective of how much you've checked the provider. So it's a bonus, but you should still keep your own due diligence procedures in place to further support these checks and reassure yourself. Some accreditation providers we've seen may be or are potentially going to be backed up by an insurance policy. And I think that will pay out to the agency or end client in the event the umbrella company defaults on the tax. Some users of umbrella companies may find this preferable to an indemnity from the umbrella company, which will only be as good as the umbrella company is financially sound or able to meet the liability. With any insurance product, while it may seem preferable, the key will be to check the fine print and the cover offered. Will this in fact provide enough cover, and will that cover be for the right things?
Sage, I was going to say advice, but it's not advice, but really good overview there, Shaz, and some really important points to watch out for. And I think it'll resonate with our listeners, the clear theme throughout, which is this joint and several liability. So yes, you can pretty much take all the steps in the world, right? You can do all the due diligence, but it doesn't offer a full guarantee. It doesn't offer a full shield from the HMRC because of the way the legislation is structured, unfortunately. But I think there's sound principles that you've outlined there, Shaz. So Shaz, we've touched briefly on labour market flexibility, potential impact of the umbrella reforms and legislation on the PSC sector. So that's, for in plain language, for independent contractors operating through a PSC or limited company structure in the UK, and how that might have a positive impact on that sector. And I certainly hope so, right? And I think that would be a good thing for the economy. But one of the themes on pretty much all our shows since we began the podcast, Shaz, is around artificial intelligence and automation and its potential negative impact on jobs, and specifically jobs displacement, which I think is a really fancy way of saying people won't have a job in a certain sector, right? And I think the statistics have really varied, right? So the World Economic Forum's forecasts have changed dramatically year on year. So back in 2023, for example, Shaz, they were forecasting job losses in the millions, right? And there wasn't going to be any replacement. 2024, they changed that somewhat to say, well, actually there'll be a net job loss, net jobs created of about 20 million, but that would involve ultimately around 67 million job losses. So jobs will be created, but the commentary from a lot of AI practitioners, leaders and companies is that, well, actually we are looking at seismic negative impacts on jobs. And really, that's something I'm concerned about. I know there's legislative frameworks that we're not here to talk about today. There's the AI EU Act, and I believe that the UK has a similar legislative regime either in place or coming into force, Shaz. But really my question is this. Are you concerned about artificial intelligence and its potential or actual impact on jobs and job losses?
As a human or as a lawyer? So as a human, my pension is not well funded enough for my job to be replaced. No, but I mean, realistically, I wish it was. But if you I joke. If you look at the headlines about artificial intelligence, as you know, you'd think we're on the brink of a mass job extinction. I see it slightly more nuanced. AI is absolutely changing work, but for most people, at least in the short to medium term, it's less that your job is disappearing overnight. It's more that your job is quietly changing a little bit underneath you. And the shift does have legal, ethical, and very human implications that employers can't, afford to ignore. But then it's also important to bear in mind we've lived through humanity has lived through various automation waves before. There's been factory mechanization, so to the arrival of computers and email. I mean, if you talk to one of my bosses who is coming up to retirement, he was telling me about a time where there was no email and you had to respond letter by letter. And one time a letter came up on his desk and it was from, he's not this old, by the way, the letter had just been lost. So it was from like 1946. And then they replied to it, yeah. But this is the point I suppose I'm making, is that there's always a new wave in humanity of how we're doing things. And we've lived and survived because humanity is basically, best place to live and survive. It's part of our intrinsic nature to find a way to survive. So I think what's different this time is two things. AI is now touching tasks that were historically seen as very human and quite protected. So it can draft, it can analyze, it can interact with customers, and even aspects of professional services. So it can start doing some of the legal tasks that we do. Second, I suppose the speed that these tools can be rolled out is almost instantly across entire organizations. You no longer need like huge capital projects to automate. You just need a software subscription and a reasonably motivated IT team. So from a jobs perspective, we are seeing significant parts of knowledge work being reshaped, and that brings employment law right to the center of the conversation. So AI tends to displace tasks, I think, before it replaces whole jobs. And so that's like, think of a role as a bundle of tasks. It's some routine, some's repetitive, some is judgment heavy, some is relational, such as managing, persuading, and mentoring. AI is coming for the routine end of that spectrum first, rather than, the mentoring, the managing, the persuading. And, it can be used for some of the more mundane parts of your tasks, such as drafting, summarizing, researching. Legally, it's not risk-free. If you significantly change what someone actually does, you can't just assume it's business as usual. You may be varying the terms of their employment. You're fundamentally changing their job content. You may actually already be making some roles redundant. So I'm not, as much as I'm trying to sit here with a positive spin on it, we can't sit here and deny that some roles are being made redundant, or you're creating a new role. And if that's done badly, with no consultation, no contractual basis, no real dialogue, you're really opening up the door to grievances and claims of constructive dismissal, a general breakdown in trust, things you really don't want to be doing as an employer. So I think some of the common mistakes we're seeing is, and I know as a lawyer I'm going to say this, but leaving the legal advice too late. Decisions about tech are made months in advance, but HR and legal are only brought in when redundancy is already a foregone conclusion, and that limits your options for redeployment and reskilling. Because that's the other big piece here. Actually, the reason humans evolve and adapt is probably due to the fact they reskill. So when email was introduced, all humans reskilled and they learned how to deal with it. And it's the same here. And the other thing to bear in mind is there's, in the background, a lot of the sort of more mundane tasks tend to be done by, and this is a generalization, but all indirect discrimination is probably based on some sort of generalization, but the roles may well be carried out by people who have those sort of protected characteristics, and actually could bring an indirect discrimination claim because it's more likely that they're affected than someone else. or their type of role, their type of, protected characteristic is more affected than someone who doesn't have that type of protected characteristic. So I think some of the more constructive conversations we're having are around reskilling and redeployment. If AI is going to take away certain tasks, what's the plan for supporting people into higher value work, training them to use the new tools, matching them with the emerging roles that's created by technology? And legally, in a redundancy scenario, you are expected to consider the reasonable alternatives, which can include training for alternative roles. But even outside of the formal redundancy context, there's a broader duty of care there, I think, and a strong reputational dimension that you want to be considering. So I suppose a final point from our perspective as lawyers is governance. In many organisations, AI is being introduced in quite a fragmented way. So a team signs up to a new tool, HR buys an AI-enabled recruitment platform, IT tests an AI assistant internally, and what's often missing is like that joined-up view of who approves the AI tool that affects employees, how legal, HR, IT, and data protection teams are involved from the start, and how you monitor the impact on jobs, diversity, and compliance over time. So we're advising our clients to treat AI affecting people as a big governance issue. You need clear policies on the acceptable use of AI, rules on human oversight of AI-driven decisions, and regular reviews of impact, particularly where jobs and livelihood are at stake. And that does somewhat touch upon the EU AI Act and all the other legal pieces surrounding AI.
Well, like Shaz, that is a masterclass on great and practical points that organizations should consider in relation to all that. Like, don't act after the fact, I think is a good one. Like, don't leave it too late to bring in your internal or external legal counsel or advisors in relation to this. And I love the way you've broken that down as well, Shaz, around skills and tasks. And I also like the way you started off the answer with, well, from a human perspective and a lawyer, right? I love the way you split.
I mean, I wish I was more financially responsible and, but we are where we are.
I love it, Chaz, but I think for our listeners, they are absolutely spot on points to consider and take heed of for sure. So Shaz, one of the things we were particularly interested in was around remote work, and we've seen a lot of return to work, or sorry, not return to work, return. I might be showing my biases here. Return to office mandates, not just in the USA, but also silent ones in the UK and in places like Ireland as well. But really simple question, but the answer might be more nuanced, like your previous one, Shaz. But from your perspective, is remote work a curse or a cure?
You see, again, I've got an answer as a human. I'm a millennial mum. So I am a millennial mum of 2 young kids. For me, remote work is absolutely what is required to enable me to be more present as a mother and maintain the career I've worked so hard to build. And I think that's one of the big reasons it's argued as the cure. It widens the talent pool to carers. It widens the talent pool to people with disabilities. It's really good for diversity. It also helps with the well-being of your employees. They've got better work-life balance, hopefully, because we can touch upon the flip side, and less commuting stress. But the flip side, or the curse side, as the question's framed, is if your home is your office, employees and employers can drift into a culture of constant availability. The policy may also be enforced unequally. So who gets to work remotely and who has to be on site? If remote work is effectively reserved for certain roles, which may or may not be more senior, there may be indirect discrimination or equal pay issues to be considered. There's also the concern that managers who may want to be in the office, who may be forcing those sort of return to office mandates, may favour the people that they see in person, which creates another potential discrimination risk. So I think a lot of companies are currently pushing for more in-person attendance, but not many are pushing for a total full-week return to work mandate, as the cure side for remote work has been acknowledged by many employers. So I think going forward, we'll continue to see a lot of the current mature, I'm going to call it, partial remote work models we're seeing now. So with smart use of office time for collaboration and learning, we'll also likely see more disputes of people challenging back to work Oops, back. I've said it now too. Back to office mandates. I'm going to blame maternity leave. Because that was back to work. Claims around indirect discrimination and arguments about what is reasonable in flexible working refusals.
Yeah, Shaz, I think it's absolutely fair comment there. So, Shaz, I'd like to finish with a question that we ask all of our guests, which is, what is your prediction or predictions for the future of work?
Oh, nice one. Um, as a contingent workforce lawyer, I'm going to say the future of work is going to be more flexible in practice, but more regulated and visible than ever before. We're moving away from a world where almost everyone is a permanent employee towards what I'd call a blended workforce. So you've got the employees, the agency temps, the consultants, the gig and platform workers, offshore teams, and increasingly AI and automation in the mix. And I suppose that shift has three big consequences. So first, I think there's going to be much more scrutiny of employment status and tax, as we are seeing. So regulators and courts are asking who is genuinely self-employed and who is effectively an employee by another name. So when you look at how government, or at least our government, gets most its, revenue, it's employment taxes, like it's the big ones. So they've got to be sure if, we're moving more and more towards a flexible look of a workplace, they're not losing that revenue as well. So there'll just be, I think, a lot more emphasis on making sure that's right. We've seen the story play out in the gig economy, but exactly the same questions apply to highly skilled contractors. If a business relies on people who look and feel like employees but are labelled as independent, it runs the risk of reclassification, back taxes, and employment law claims. Second, I think there's the blurred lines of responsibility. When you have employees and non-employees working side by side, often managed by the same people using the same systems, you have to be crystal clear about who is responsible for pay, benefits, health and safety, discrimination, data protection. And that's where the issues like co-employment, IR35, and supply chain liability really bite. The future of work will demand better structures and governance, so flexibility doesn't become an accidental employment relationship. And then I think third is the reputation. Investors, customers, and employees are no longer just asking, how do you treat your staff? They're asking, how do you treat everyone who works for you? And that includes the agency workers and the platform workers. So things like fair pay, working hours, diversity, and even algorithmic decision making are going to be judged across the whole labour pool and not just the payroll. So I think my headline is more blended, more regulated, and more ethically charged. The organisations that win will be those that treat contingent talent as part of their single workforce strategy and building models that are flexible, legally robust, and fair in practice and not just on paper.
Go on, Shaz. What a lovely way to finish our show on an optimistic way as well, but also with really firm governance and risk management models in place. Shaz, thanks so much for making the time to come on the show. Thanks so much for making the time to come and speak with our audience.
No, it's been lovely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been great, Shaz, and I think it's fair to say from my seat that was a masterclass in the UK umbrella legislation stroke reforms, and I think some key dates to mention around April 2026 this year. A bit like IR35 when we were talking about this in the private sector. It's never too late to start, and it's never too late to prepare, and it's never too late to start looking at this. But
I really want to emphasize that point. So again, with IR35, that actually waited for me. So well, that's what my boss says. I went off on maternity leave in March for my first child. This is March 2020.
yes.
And as I was giving birth, he messaged me because the reforms were due to come in just before I was genuinely giving birth. And he messaged me to be like, just so you know, IR35 has been delayed. And I couldn't have been better timing, Kevin. I came back in March 2021 and there was just panic, total panic, because no one had prepared.
That's right.
So my main point is please prepare before March 2026. because I do not have the capacity to do that again.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on, Shaz. I think it's not too late, but you got to start now. I think is the best way I would summarize our show today. So, Shaz, just where can our audience, if they want to reach out, talk to you or Osborne Clarke about any employment, labour law, or M&A in the workforce solutions world or human capital, what's the best way to reach out or come and talk to you about the UK umbrella reform, Shaz?
However you want to reach out, you can call me, you can email me, you can come to any of so we've got in-person events. You can look on our website. We've got a really detailed briefing which breaks down a lot of the umbrella reforms, which I would highly recommend having a look over. It really does try and break it down for you so you know exactly what you're facing. But yeah, however you want.
Brilliant. And I highly recommend those guides and the in-person events that Osborne Clarke and Shaz and her team put out. They're really instructive, really helpful, and very useful for anyone that is contemplating going on this journey. Also, Shaz has very kindly agreed to come on a webinar to discuss the UK umbrella reforms. We'll publish the date in advance on LinkedIn, but please join us because listening to you, Shaz, on this topic makes what some would consider dull to be absolutely fascinating, and I don't consider it dull at all. And you've really brought this to life, Shaz, to me, and I'm sure to our audience. So, Shaz, wishing you a great day ahead. Thanks so much for making the time for us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Open Talent Report with Conor Heaney. If you found this podcast informative and engaging, make sure you subscribe, tell your friends, and follow us on all your favorite streaming platforms.